Hello, welcome to New Idea Engineering Seminar, Are You Paying Too Much for Search? Part 3, Pricing and RFIs. I'm Miles Kehoe, one of the founders of New Idea Engineering, and I'm joined by Mark Bennett, who's another one of the founders here, who is our Chief Technology Officer, who will be participating in the webinar as well. As I said, this is the third video in the series. The first one was about user expectations. The second one was called about vendor hopping, which is the tendency companies have to want to switch from one vendor to another if they're unhappy rather than trying to solve the problem. And this one is pricing and RFIs, where we'll talk about those issues here. Feel free to find the other webinars on YouTube or on our website. So first, let's talk about pricing models. I want you to know that that pricing models change widely based on the vendor. It can be a wild switch, and even within the same vendor, depending on what time of the year you find the vendor, what time of the quarter, you can get an incredibly wide price range from vendors. We actually had one customer years ago who was looking at one of the major vendors we'd introduced him to, and on a phone conference to demonstrate the product, the customer was quite pleased, and he said in this sort of Texas drawl, "Well, that looks pretty good. What are you all going to charge me for that?" And there was silence on the line, and he finally said, "Well, how about just a ballpark? I'm not going to hold you, just ballpark." And so there was a little more silence, and they said, "Well, we're thinking maybe $3 million. And the customer and I were both shocked, and he said, "Well, why don't you guys get your head together and come back to me and tell me what the real answer is?" So about a week later, we got on a call with him, and the vendor was there, and the vendor said, "Well, we think I'm going to do a sleight of hand, or do an OEM, or $300,000, which was a one-tenth the price in one fell swoop." So trust me, if my customer hadn't pushed back on the $3 million, he would have paid $3 million for the software. So keep that in mind. Please remember it's negotiable. I'm sure when you're buying a car, you don't buy a sticker price with all the undercoating. Do the same thing with a search engine for your company. Everything is negotiable. Also, the models are different between vendors. Some based on volume of data, some based on volume, how many queries per second, how many servers you need. Those are all easy things to negotiate with the vendors. Make sure you understand what it is you're buying, what kind of client access licenses, whatever. One other thing, we'll talk about it a little bit in the RFI, beware of presenting with an incredibly complex feature matrix. That is, don't go to the vendor with a list of everything you've heard at every search show, on every website, and every webinar you've ever attended, and say those are required features, because trust me, you'll pay a lot more, whereas if you've got some room to give a little bit on some of those, you might find you could save quite a bit of money on search. Some of the surprises that come up when people are pricing search engines. First, beware that the implementation cost can sometimes exceed the cost of the software license. Make sure that you understand, especially if the vendor's doing the work, understand what part of the software, which part of the license is software, which part is license for the system, and also who's going to be doing the work. Is it employees of the company, or is it a third party that they've hired to do work as if they were the company, so that you know who's actually responsible for it. Also, be aware of the cost of the machines, both when you first roll out and the lifetime of the machine. Make sure you understand also things about how many servers are they going to license you for. Will you pay for staging and for production systems, or only for the live production machines? Will you pay for its development system? Make sure that is clear up front and that you negotiate that with your vendor. We actually had one customer who was using a tier 1 software vendor, quite well-known brand, and because their data volume was growing, they were pulling a lot of archive data in, they found they were spending a lot of money on servers each year. They were adding a bunch of very large servers, and they switched to a different vendor who was also a tier 1 vendor, and their ROI justification was that they would spend less on the software license than the hardware they would have had to buy in the first year with the previous software vendor. So be aware of that kind of difference between the vendors as well. Also, of course, be sure you understand the support and maintenance and training costs, and things like, is it per seat, how many queries per second, data size, all those things are an issue. Training costs especially, make sure they're going to train not just the developers, but the business line managers and the IT people who will be running the search, because that's all a critical part of what it's going to take to run the operation once it's going. I'm going to switch real quick now to RFIs, requests for information. Some companies go right to an RFQ, request for quotation. These are often put together by search teams or requirements teams, sometimes with outside help. And very often we've seen RFIs, RFQs come up as sort of the RFI from hell. What I mean by that is that they do have every feature they've ever heard of and some that no one's ever heard of. You want to make sure, and of course they list all of those as required. You want to make sure that you've got the requirements that you need and that you need in the first rollout, and then understand how you can upgrade that later on if they'll things you'll need a year or two. If you're bringing on a contact management system or a big SRM system, be sure you understand if that comes 2 years later how you're going to integrate with that. So it has to fit in your overall IT environment. RFIs that don't ask an answerable question, and by that I mean you'll sometimes see questions like, is your software scalable? Well, there's not a software vendor in the world that will not answer yes to that, and if all you're looking at is yes or no's, you're not going to get the true answer. And you don't want to micromanage the implementation over the capabilities. Make sure you get what you need and that you can manage it well and go from there.
You know, Miles, one of the issues on that micromanaging is if somebody's had a vendor where they're used to tuning relevance in a certain way, relevancy tuning is one of the things that RFIs often talk about. When they go to the next vendor or 2 or 3 other vendors, they may talk a lot about, they may ask the requirements in the form of exactly how the previous vendor did things. The new vendor probably has the same capabilities, but they're probably called something else and they may work slightly differently. So, you know, it's better to leave it a little bit open-ended.
That's a great point, Mark. The other thing, of course, is one of the things that can always be embarrassing in an RFI or RFQ is if you're asking for a feature set that one vendor calls by a specific name. You don't want to have blaring tires if that's what one of the vendors calls their product, when in fact what you really want is relevance tuning. So be sure that you sort of anonymize that if that's kind of important. The other thing is a lot of here costs of bad RFIs. We're getting to this. That, as I said, overbuying capacity for features cost you money. One vendor used to charge money based on how the size of the text that you index, but it turns out there was a discrepancy between the way their license manager measured data and the way that the sales guys measured data. And if you didn't push hard on insisting to get what the license manager said you needed, you were going to pay much more money. We actually had one customer who had overpaid for extra capacity by about $70,000 before they called us in and had to do some other work, and they found out they spent way too much money. And as I said, additional features that you don't need that are in there may cost you money. If there's a feature the customer or the vendor has and he says, you really want this, if you don't want it, tell them you don't want to pay for it. Get that piece taken out. They can do that. There's a lot of room, trust me. Another thing about RFIs is we've seen projects go on for 5 or 6 months to put together an RFI or an RFQ and then meet with the vendors. It distracts you from your core priority, which is making your content searchable or findable. You want it to be a good requirement specification, but you don't want to have micromanaging everything. And some questions you ask will just invite vendor hype. Why we always have had scalable technology. Well, you don't want that. You just want to know the answer. One other thing you'll run into here is that when you go through an RFI, RFQ, I suggest you don't say we're going to pick a winner based on that. We'd suggest what you do is pick 1 or 2, or 2 or 3 of the best vendors, the ones you seem most compatible with, and ask them to come in and do an on-site proof of concept for you. The vendors will hate doing it, but they will do it. And the reason I say that is because the real test for search engine is how it works on your data, and you won't know that till it's on site. Having them come on site even for a week to index your stuff, show you how it works, you'll learn a lot about what it's going to take for you when you buy the product. So as I said, there are a few things you want to make sure you want to ask. You want to talk about the expected skill set. What does this vendor expect from you in terms of IT skills, in terms of programming development skills, and probably the most important is in terms of the skills you'll need to manage this search engine going forward. How do you do best bets? How do you do thesaurus? This is how the business owner administers search, which is becoming increasingly important. Understand the deployment process. Understand how patches happen. As I said a little bit earlier, are they going to charge you for staging area or failover machines, or are they going to charge you only for machines that are actually, say, load balanced online? Make sure that all those things are defined before you get the selection gone, and then it's a little bit too late. Mark actually is going to talk for a few minutes about one of the processes we've seen really work well at customers who are trying to figure out from their end users what people really want. Mark, why don't you come in here?
Well, sure. So in addition to an RFI with too many features, I would say on average more than 50% of the features are mark required. I've seen as many as 80% of features on RFIs mark required. even if you did want to pay for all of those features, you're certainly not going to deploy them in the first year, and it does impact how much you're going to spend, but also how much time you're going to spend. So once you get everybody, no one ever wants to cut a feature from the required list. So this is kind of a fun exercise. You can either do this as a group over like a pizza lunch, or you can do this one-on-one. And you can do it with paper. We call it dev dollars, but you don't necessarily have to have little actual dollar currency. But the idea is that you're going to come up with a list of all the features. Typically, you try to summarize the feature areas on 1 to 2 pages. And you're going to give people a box next to each feature or each feature set. And you're going to tell them that, look, it's great. We have got all your feedback, and it's fantastic. But hey, let's prioritize some of these things. You have 100 dev dollars, and you can spend them on any of these features in $5 increments. We don't want you doing, 50 cents here, 50 cents there. So essentially, 100 dev dollars in $5 increments. They basically get 20 votes. And it's kind of like the old penny sale. If they want to put, $20 on one particular feature, that's fine. You need to warn people that this is not a binding vote. Obviously, management can always come in and, dictate, for other reasons or whatever. But essentially, you're telling them that this is information gathering to get tiebreaker feedback on the really required features. And so at the end, everybody has filled in, their votes, and it's surprising, somebody who insisted at the beginning of the exercise that things were required, there were differences in what they will have come up with. And the other thing you want to ask, especially if you're doing this, with a lot of people, is that you'd like their contact information. You don't have to make it mandatory. But generally speaking, if there was a particular area that some people were very interested in or perhaps very knowledgeable in, if they've given you follow-up information, you can actually do a subsequent exercise to drill down on some particular set of features, and you really do want to get the key stakeholders and the people who are very interested in there. So do ask for that. But in the end, you will find some features that really do attract more dev dollars. It's just a question of prioritization. You're not saying that things are important or not. It's interesting, Miles recently did this exercise at a company that, had a lot of features, and on some of the required features, I was very interested to look at the spreadsheet. There were, I think, 5 or 6 required features that people insisted that had 0 dev dollars. And I don't know, Miles, if you remember how many people you had on that exercise, but I mean, it was interesting to see the number of things that got no contact, no interest at all, in terms of dev dollars.
Yeah,
again, so you wanted to.
It's really true, Mark. Yeah, there are a lot of people that had things they just absolutely had to have, but they weren't willing to spend any money, which pretty much said what their priorities were. So that's
it's a question of prioritization. You're not arguing with them; you're just prioritizing.
Exactly. All right. Well, that's pretty good stuff. That is a great exercise, Mark. I think it's worked very well for us. We see it in a lot of places, and it's a good way to find out what's really important. So let's do this. That about finishes the third of the 3 webinars we've got recorded. I want to tell you a little about who we are.
Sure, Miles. Miles and I have been doing this since, he's been working with search since 1989. I've been working with search since 1991, but we founded New Data Engineering in 1996. We've been focusing on the business and technology of search. Some consulting agencies are, just the bits and bytes in the technology, and that's great. But we've also tried, especially in the last 10 years, to also talk about the business side, search engine selection, vendor relationships, strategic things of planning for, life cycle of projects, etc. We've always tried to be vendor neutral. We have worked with, I believe, every single engine on the market, or almost every engine on the market, and certainly have talked to every engine. We've worked with a lot of commercial engines. We've also worked with a number of open source engines as well. We speak and blog. There's some URLs on there for you, but we've, especially Miles, he travels quite a bit to speak at different shows. And although we're very active in the open source community, we also we've got a book deal to do a book on fast search, and then they were acquired by Microsoft, so we've got a Microsoft book out there. And it's funny, being a techie, after FAST was acquired by Microsoft, of course, FAST had a Linux product, so I got to write the Linux chapter of a Microsoft book, so that was kind of fun.
Probably the only place where you read about Linux configurations for multi-servers in the Linux environment. So
that was great. So
All right.
that about wraps it up. Miles, on this last slide, we've got some, if people have any questions at all, would like to chat further, you can only gloss over a number of subjects and these things. You can't drill down deeply on these webinars, and everybody's situation is different. Please do contact us at info@ideng.com or give us a call. We'd really like to hear from you, and thank you for visiting our webinar.
Thanks very much. Goodbye.